The gavel slammed down with a finality that echoed through the sterile boardroom, each reverberation striking like a physical blow. Across the polished mahogany table, Liliana's brother leaned back in his leather chair, his expression a mixture of triumph and barely concealed satisfaction. The documents spelling out her termination lay scattered between them, their official seals mocking her from every angle. "You're done, Liliana," Marcus declared, his voice carrying the weight of their family name and the power it commanded across international shipping lanes. "Effective immediately. Don't bother coming back to the office tomorrow." His eyes, so similar to hers yet now filled with cold calculation, scanned her face for any sign of weakness or defeat. Liliana felt the weight of every eye in the room upon her, executives who had once sought her counsel, colleagues who had shared late-night strategy sessions, all now silent witnesses to her public humiliation. Her fingers tightened imperceptibly on the edge of the table, knuckles whitening against the rich wood. 3 years of blood, sweat, and sacrifice poured into building Marcus's empire were being dismissed with a single signature. The irony wasn't lost on her as she processed his words. Marcus, who had always been the golden child, the natural successor to their father's legacy, was terminating the very person who had transformed his struggling company into an industry leader. She had been the one to negotiate the critical contracts, the one who had restructured their logistics network, the one who had personally charmed their most important clients. And now, he was cutting her loose, citing restructuring and consolidation as the official reasons. Her mind raced through the events that had led to this moment, the subtle shifts in company dynamics over the past months, the way Marcus had gradually excluded her from key meetings, the whispers in hallways that had grown louder with each passing week. It had all been leading to this calculated move, this public execution of her professional identity. Despite the heat rising in her chest, Liliana forced herself to meet Marcus's gaze directly. She watched as his confident smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second, betraying the uncertainty beneath his bravado. In that fleeting moment, she saw not just her brother but also the frightened young man who had always needed to prove himself more capable, more worthy than anyone else in the family. The silence stretched taut, broken only by the distant hum of New York City traffic filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the harbor stretched endlessly, its waters reflecting the afternoon sun in glittering patterns that seemed to mock the storm brewing within these walls. Ships moved steadily along their predetermined paths, unaware of the drama unfolding in this corporate tower that overlooked their domain. As Marcus continued speaking, detailing the severance package and confidentiality agreements, Liliana's attention drifted to the panoramic view behind him. Beyond the sparkling skyscrapers and bustling streets lay the docks, miles of concrete and steel that represented both her greatest achievement and her ultimate insurance policy. While Marcus prattled on about legal formalities, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile that went unnoticed by everyone except perhaps the oldest executive at the far end of the table, whose bushy eyebrows rose slightly in recognition. The memory of that first meeting 3 years ago flashed through her mind with crystal clarity. Marcus had approached her, desperation etched into every line of his face, begging her to save their father's crumbling shipping empire. At the time, she'd been running successful operations at the Port Authority, known throughout the industry as the woman who could turn around dying terminals and make them profitable again. He'd promised her equal partnership, a true 50-50 split in leadership and decision-making. How naive she'd been to believe him. For 3 years, she'd worked tirelessly, pouring everything she had into transforming their father's outdated business model into a modern logistics powerhouse. She remembered the countless nights spent poring over spreadsheets, the endless negotiations with union leaders, the strategic alliances she'd forged with key players in the Port Authority. Every success had been met with Marcus's praise, every victory celebrated as a joint achievement. But somewhere along the way, things had shifted. What began as casual suggestions became direct orders. Recommendations made in team meetings were suddenly attributed solely to Marcus during board presentations. Her innovative approaches to streamlining operations were rebranded as his vision for the future. Each slight had been subtle, almost imperceptible to outsiders, but to Liliana, they were as clear as day. The turning point came 6 months ago when she brokered the deal of a lifetime, exclusive rights to operate 3 prime terminal locations along the eastern seaboard. The contract negotiations had taken months, requiring every ounce of her expertise and influence within the Port Authority circles. When the papers were finally signed, Marcus had taken the credit entirely, announcing the acquisition to shareholders as his personal achievement while relegating her to a footnote in the press release. What hurt most wasn't just the betrayal of their agreement, but the realization that Marcus would never see her as an equal partner. To him, She would always be the little sister who needed guidance, who required his protection and direction. The industry recognition she'd earned, the respect she'd garnered among maritime professionals worldwide, none of it mattered to him. In his eyes, she was still the same girl who used to follow him around the family estate, asking for approval and validation. As Marcus droned on about severance packages and non-disclosure agreements, Liliana's thoughts turned to the careful preparations she'd made over the past year. She'd seen the writing on the wall long before today's meeting. Each attempt to marginalize her contributions, every effort to diminish her role in the company's success, had been met with quiet determination rather than open confrontation. Instead of fighting Marcus directly, she'd focused on building something far more powerful, a network of alliances, partnerships, and strategic positions that would ensure her survival beyond the confines of their family business. The docks had become her sanctuary, her fortress against her brother's growing ambition. Terminal 17, with its state-of-the-art facilities and prime location, had been her first major project after joining the company. Through her connections and negotiating skills, she'd secured a 20-year lease at below-market rates, positioning it perfectly to handle the new generation of container ships. But more importantly, she'd structured the agreement through a series of holding companies and shell corporations that ultimately traced back to her personal accounts. This pattern had repeated itself across multiple ports. Newark's automated terminal, Baltimore's refrigerated storage facility, Norfolk's specialized cargo handling operation, each bore Marcus's name on official documents, but beneath the surface lay a web of financial arrangements that ensured Liliana's control. The maintenance contracts, the labor agreements, the IT infrastructure upgrades, all funneled through entities she secretly owned or influenced. Her smile widened imperceptibly as she recalled Marcus's excitement when she presented him with the opportunity to expand into Philadelphia. He'd been so focused on the potential profits, so eager to claim another victory for his portfolio, that he hadn't noticed how each operational detail played into her larger strategy. The fueling contracts alone gave her leverage over half the shipping traffic along the Eastern Corridor. The repair facilities she'd helped establish created bottlenecks that could be opened or closed with a single phone call. Most crucially, she'd maintained excellent relationships with the port authorities themselves. These weren't mere professional connections. They were friendships built on mutual respect and shared goals. The harbor masters, the union leaders, the customs officials, all knew where their true loyalty lay. They understood that while Marcus might own the brand, it was Liliana who kept the gears turning smoothly, who navigated the complex world of maritime politics with grace and effectiveness. The knowledge of this hidden empire gave her strength as Marcus continued his monologue about transition plans and exit strategies. Each word he spoke only served to reinforce her confidence in what she'd built. The shipping empire he thought he controlled was, in reality, precariously balanced atop a foundation of her making. Without her influence, without her carefully cultivated network of dependencies and alliances, his precious company would grind to a halt faster than he could imagine. Marcus finally paused, his voice trailing off as he waited for some reaction, some sign of defeat or anger from his sister. Instead, he found himself staring at a smile that sent an unexpected chill down his spine. Liliana's expression wasn't one of resignation or despair, it was something far more dangerous. Her eyes, usually warm and engaging, had taken on a calculating sharpness he'd never seen before. "So that's it?" she asked softly, her voice carrying through the silent room with unsettling calm. "You think firing me is going to solve your problems?" She stood slowly, deliberately gathering her few personal items from the table. "You've made a grave mistake, Marcus. One you'll regret every time a ship waits at anchor, every time a container sits idle, every time your precious schedules start slipping." The executives exchanged uneasy glances as tension crackled through the air. Marcus's face flushed, his carefully constructed facade beginning to crack under his sister's steady gaze. "You're bluffing," he snapped, though his voice lacked conviction. "The company will continue just fine without you. We've documented all your processes, standardized everything." Liliana's laugh was low and musical, sending a ripple of discomfort through the assembled board members. "Documented? Standardized?" She shook her head, her smile widening. "Oh Marcus, you truly don't understand, do you? Those standardized processes depend on people who answer to me, not you. Those documented procedures require cooperation from unions I've spent years cultivating relationships with. Your precious documentation means nothing without the goodwill and trust I've built." She took a step toward the window, looking out over the harbor where dozens of ships were visible in the distance. Let me paint you a picture. Tomorrow morning, when your operations manager tries to coordinate dock assignments, he'll find there's been a sudden change in priority scheduling. When your maintenance teams need parts, they'll discover unexpected delays in procurement. When your captains try to refuel, they'll encounter technical difficulties with the pumping systems. Turning back to face the room, she let her words sink in. And that's just the beginning. The color drained from Marcus's face as he processed her words. You wouldn't dare sabotage your own work, he protested weakly. Father built this company. Father built a company that couldn't adapt, Liliana interrupted sharply. I'm the one who brought it into the modern age. I'm the one who made it relevant again. And unlike you, I remember exactly who helped us along the way. She gestured toward the window. Every crane operator, every longshoreman, every harbor pilot out there knows exactly who fought for their interests, who negotiated fair contracts, who respected their expertise. The room fell deathly silent as Liliana moved toward the door. Before stepping out, she paused and looked back at the stunned faces. Enjoy your victory, Marcus. Savor it while it lasts. Because starting tomorrow, you'll learn exactly how much my work was worth to this company. With that, she walked out, leaving behind a boardroom filled with people who suddenly understood they just witnessed something far more complex than a simple termination. The elevator ride down felt eternal, each descending floor marking not just a physical journey but an emotional transformation. As the numbers ticked downward, Liliana felt the weight lifting from her shoulders, replaced by a sense of liberation she hadn't experienced in years. The rush of adrenaline from the confrontation was giving way to a deeper, steadier confidence, the kind that comes from knowing you hold all the cards in a high-stakes game. Stepping into the lobby, she caught her reflection in the glass doors and barely recognized the woman staring back. Gone was the dutiful sister, the dedicated executive willing to sacrifice everything for family loyalty. In her place stood someone stronger, more determined, a woman who had finally embraced her own power. The smile that had unnerved Marcus earlier returned, this time genuine and unforced, as she pushed through the revolving doors into the crisp autumn air. The city buzzed around her, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred in the corporate tower behind her. Taxi horns blared, pedestrians hurried along sidewalks, and above it all, seagulls wheeled against the steel-gray sky. Yet despite the chaos, Liliana felt an unusual clarity settle over her mind. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about Marcus's expectations, her father's legacy, or the company's quarterly projections. Instead, she was considering possibilities, real, tangible opportunities that stretched far beyond the confines of family obligation. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, and she pulled it out to see multiple notifications from contacts across the industry. News of her termination had already spread, confirming what she'd suspected about corporate grapevines. What surprised her, however, was the nature of the messages. Rather than expressions of sympathy or offers of support, most were inquiries about availability, invitations to discuss future projects, even unsolicited job offers. The maritime community, it seemed, had already recognized the significance of her departure. Walking briskly toward the waterfront, Liliana allowed herself to consider scenarios that had once seemed impossible. There was the offer from Rotterdam to consult on their smart port initiative, something she'd always wanted to pursue but never had time for. The proposal from Singapore to help develop their next-generation terminal, a project that aligned perfectly with her vision for the future of shipping. Even the discreet inquiry from certain influential figures about forming her own independent operation, an idea that sent both excitement and apprehension coursing through her veins. The cool breeze from the harbor carried with it the familiar sense of salt water and diesel, grounding her in the reality of the industry she loved. She passed groups of dockworkers taking their breaks, many of whom nodded respectfully in her direction. These were the people who had taught her the true nature of shipping, not the polished boardroom presentations or fancy industry conferences, but the gritty, essential work that kept global trade flowing. Their acknowledgement reminded her of why she'd entered this business in the first place, to make a difference, to innovate, to create something meaningful. Reaching the edge of the pier, Liliana stopped and looked out over the water. Dozens of ships dotted the horizon, their lights beginning to twinkle against the deepening dusk. Each vessel represented not just cargo and profit margins, but stories, journeys undertaken, lives touched, economies sustained. For 3 years, she'd poured her soul into ensuring these ships moved efficiently, safely, profitably. Now, standing here free from Marcus's shadow, she realized she could do so much more. Her mind began working through the practical implications of her new position. The network of alliances she'd built wasn't just a safety net, it was a foundation for something greater. The terminal leases, the maintenance contracts, the operational agreements, all these assets could be leveraged in ways Marcus couldn't even comprehend. More importantly, she had the trust and respect of an entire industry, something money couldn't buy and Marcus could never replicate. Yet amidst these exciting possibilities, a sobering thought emerged. Power, especially in an industry as cutthroat as shipping, was a double-edged sword. The same leverage that protected her could easily become a weapon if wielded carelessly. The relationships she'd nurtured demanded reciprocity, not exploitation. The respect she'd earned required constant maintenance through integrity and fairness. Marcus had underestimated these principles. She wouldn't make the same mistake. The sound of approaching footsteps broke her reverie. Turning, she saw Michael Chun, the senior harbor master, approaching with his characteristic measured pace. His weathered face split into a knowing smile as he joined her at the railing. "Heard about your meeting," he said simply, his voice carrying the wisdom of decades spent navigating both literal and metaphorical waters. "Figured you'd want to see this." From his coat pocket, he produced a folded document, a preliminary agreement for expanded operations at Terminal 22, one of the most strategically located facilities in the harbor. The signatures at the bottom belonged to every key stakeholder except one, hers. Looking up, she met Michael's steady gaze and understood the magnitude of what he was offering. This wasn't just an olive branch, it was a declaration of faith in her abilities, a vote of confidence from someone who had witnessed firsthand the value she brought to the industry. Taking the document, Liliana felt a surge of gratitude mixed with responsibility. The path forward would be challenging, marked by difficult decisions and potential conflicts. Marcus wouldn't go quietly, and the industry would be watching closely to see how she handled this unprecedented situation. Yet as she stood there, document in hand, surrounded by the sights and sounds of the harbor she loved, she knew one thing for certain: this moment wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of something far greater than she'd ever imagined possible. The harbor lights reflected in her eyes as she turned back to Michael. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing words couldn't fully express what this gesture meant. "I won't let you down." Together, they stood watching as darkness fell completely, transforming the industrial landscape into a tapestry of glowing points stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere in that expanse of water and steel lay her future, complex, challenging, and filled with possibilities that excited and terrified her in equal measure. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus quickly discovered just how dependent his empire was on Liliana's invisible hand. Ships sat idle at anchor, unable to dock because of unexpected scheduling conflicts. Critical repair work stalled as parts mysteriously failed to arrive. Union leaders who had once been cooperative now cited procedural delays or labor shortages. The sleek machinery of his shipping operation began grinding to a halt, and panic rippled through every level of the company. Liliana watched from afar, not with malice but with quiet satisfaction. She hadn't actively sabotaged anything, she didn't need to. The system she'd built over 3 years required her subtle influence to function smoothly, and without it, cracks were inevitable. Her phone buzzed constantly with desperate calls from Marcus's executives, begging for her intervention. She ignored them all, focusing instead on solidifying her own position in the industry. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the harbor, Michael Chun joined her again at Terminal 22. They stood side by side, watching cranes unload containers under the glow of floodlights. "You've made your point," he said finally, his tone measured. "Now what?" She smiled faintly, turning to face him. "Now I build something better." With Michael's support, and that of countless others who trusted her vision, Liliana began assembling her own network. Terminals she'd secretly secured leases for became hubs of innovation. Unions rallied behind her fair practices, and longshoremen praised her leadership. Within months, she launched an independent logistics company that prioritized efficiency, sustainability, and worker welfare, the very principles Marcus had dismissed as impractical. Word spread like wildfire throughout the industry. Ports along the eastern seaboard clamored to partner with her, knowing her reputation for transforming operations while maintaining integrity. Investors lined up, eager to back someone who had proven they could navigate both corporate politics and maritime realities. Even some of Marcus's most loyal executives quietly jumped ship, drawn to Liliana's clear vision and ethical approach. Marcus, meanwhile, struggled to keep his empire afloat. His attempts to rebuild relationships fell flat. No amount of charm or money could replace the trust Liliana had cultivated over years. Desperate, he reached out to their father, hoping for guidance, or perhaps intervention, but their aging patriarch simply shook his head. "I warned you," he said gravely. "Liliana isn't just smart. She's strategic. You underestimated her." By the end of the year, Marcus's company was a shadow of its former self. Profits plummeted, clients defected, and morale hit rock bottom. In a final act of desperation, he tried to sell off assets to stay afloat, but found many of them tied up in agreements Liliana controlled. It was then, standing in yet another tense boardroom meeting, that he realized there was only one way out. He called Liliana personally. When she answered, her voice was calm, almost gentle. "What do you want, Marcus?" There was a long pause before he spoke, his usual bravado replaced by raw vulnerability. I need your help." For a moment, she considered refusing. After everything he'd done, he deserved to face the consequences of his actions. But then she thought about their father, about the legacy they were both fighting to preserve, and about the future she wanted to create. Revenge wasn't the goal, redemption was. "Come see me tomorrow," she said simply. "We'll talk." The next morning, Marcus arrived at her new office, a modest space overlooking the bustling docks. Gone were the opulent trappings of his former headquarters. This place hummed with purpose, filled with people working toward a shared mission. When he walked in, Liliana greeted him not as an enemy but as a brother. They sat down together, hashing out terms that would allow Marcus to salvage what remained of his business while ensuring Liliana retained control of key operations. It wasn't charity, it was strategy. By keeping Marcus tethered to her success, she ensured stability for the entire industry. And perhaps, in time, reconciliation might be possible. As they shook hands to seal the agreement, Liliana felt a profound sense of peace. This wasn't just victory, it was closure. She had taken everything Marcus had thrown at her and turned it into fuel for something greater. The docks weren't just hers anymore, they were a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and hope. That night, standing on the pier where it had all begun, Liliana looked out over the water. Ships moved steadily in and out of port, guided by lights that seemed brighter than ever. Somewhere in the distance, a foghorn sounded, echoing across the harbor like a benediction. She smiled softly, feeling the cool breeze against her face. For the first time in years, she knew exactly who she was, and exactly where she belonged.